Good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Vilashini Cooppan, and I am a professor of literature and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. I will be your moderator for tonight's event. The UCSC University Forum is an ongoing series featuring the relevance of our research to the broader community and to contemporary social, political, environmental, and economic issues. We proudly feature the impact of research conducted here at UCSC with all of you. Let me start with a land acknowledgement, a recognition of the history of Indigenous communities in this region and their enduring relationship to their homelands. The land where UC Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Upi people. Today, the Amamutsin tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of Indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during the Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. February, Black History Month, also invites us to recognize a history that has too often been forgotten as foundational to the making of the United States. Tonight, we present a crucial conversation about the history of the slave trade within the Americas, a history we will be looking at not just from a US perspective, but from a global one, encompassing the Americas, the African diaspora, and the broader formation of structures of capitalism and culture throughout. We will be asking, in the spirit of Black History Month, what it means to confront a history, to encounter it in documents and records that cannot tell the whole story, to find ways to present that history so scholars can continue the long and necessary work of reckoning with slavery. Our conversation tonight brings together a historian of slavery with Black studies and literary critics alongside your own questions. We're going to be using a webinar tool tonight, so there is no chat function. Instead, we ask you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. I will be monitoring those questions, and we will have an opportunity to answer them towards the end of the program. Tonight's event will be recorded. Let me now introduce our speaker and my co-commenter. Professor Gregory E. O'Malley is Associate Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz. His first book, Final Passages, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America, 1619 to 1807, received 4 awards from the American Historical Association, the Prize for British History, its Raleigh Prize for Atlantic History, the Owsley Award from the Southern Historical Association, and the Gouveia Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians. Professor O'Malley's book examines a complex network that distributed enslaved Africans throughout North Africa and the Caribbean after the survival of the Middle Passage or Atlantic crossing. Professor O'Malley is also the co-editor with Alex Barucki of the Inter-American Slave Trade Database, an online research tool that documents more than 24,000 slave trading voyages from one port in the Americas to the other, or to another. He is currently at work on a new book titled The Escapes of David George, an Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom in the Revolutionary Era, which is the life history of a man who was born enslaved in colonial Virginia and whose attempts to escape bondage resulted in wide-ranging travels and eventual emancipation during the Revolutionary War. Our other speaker, or my co-commenter, is Professor Gina Dent. Gina Dent is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, and Legal Studies at UC Santa Cruz. She is a committed activist, scholar, public speaker, and educator. She's received the Dzikis Faculty Teaching Award in the Humanities in 2019 and the Chancellor's Award for Diversity in 2007. Her longstanding work in the fields of Black feminism, Black studies, human rights, and prison abolitionism has resulted in a recent new book titled Abolition, Feminism Now, co-authored by Dent with Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, and Erica Miners. Professor Dent is also directing a multi-year series funded by the Mellon Foundation titled Visualizing Abolition and based on a series she ran last year as well. She's also co-editing a book by that title with Rachel Nelson. In addition, she has edited Prison as a Border, Black popular culture, and authored numerous articles on race, feminism, popular culture, and visual art. Professor Dent is a member of Scholars for Social Justice, the Portal Project, and currently works with national and international organizations on a variety of justice-related concerns. I'm now going to turn this evening over to Professor O'Malley, who is going to present for us about half an hour of his previous and work around these questions, and we will then ask questions, Gina and I, and we will then open it up to your questions, and which I hope you will be putting into the Q&A chat. Into the Q&A, not into the chat. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Vilashini. And I'm hoping you all are now seeing my slides. I also want to quickly thank Nicole Silva, Diana Hogue, and everyone involved in the University Forum lecture series for the invitation to be here tonight. I want to thank Vilashini and Gina for participating in the event with me. I also want to give some thanks to the Humanities Institute at UCSC for all the support for my research and administering the grants that come in to support that research. And last but not least, a big thank you to everyone out there in Zoom land who's joined us tonight. I can't see you all, but I know you're out there, and I appreciate people coming and having a listen to what we've got to talk about. So let's dive into that. We're here to talk about what I've titled Beyond the Middle Passage, slave trading within the Americas. And the within is kind of an important word within that title. I've spent most of my professional life to this point researching the intercolonial slave trade. So I want to start by just explaining what that is. It's not something that I expect many in the audience have heard of. Few historians have paid attention to the intercolonial slave trade as opposed to the much more well-known transatlantic slave trade, at least until recently. And the main argument of my scholarship has been that this needs to change, that we need to be paying more attention to this other phase of the slave trade, not in place of, but in addition to the transatlantic slave trade. And by the intercolonial slave trade, I simply mean the slave trade between American colonies, from one American colony to another. And I want to just contextualize that a bit to help give a sense of what I've been working on. To date, the vast majority of slave trade research has been on the transatlantic slave trade, or the infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic. And over the past 50 years, we've learned a tremendous amount about that. We've learned about the raw numbers of people moved and the major routes along which they've been moved, especially thanks to a project known as the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. This is a collaboration over decades of scholars from various places around the world, working to document one at a time every single voyage that moved enslaved people across the sorry, I just realized my slides aren't in the right mode. Sorry about that. Hopefully that looks a little bit better. Every voyage that moved enslaved people across the Atlantic. We've also learned a ton about the conditions on these ships, the shipboard's experiences that captives endure, the violence, the crowding, the resistance of enslaved people to their captivity, and the horrific mortality on these voyages through disease and violence and other means. There's also been a lot of scholarship over the last several decades on enslaved people's cultures in the African diaspora, the knowledge, the beliefs that they carried through these journeys of enslavement, and how those backgrounds shaped the American societies in which they landed. But for all the great scholarship on the Middle Passage, the focus has remained primarily on that Atlantic crossing among scholars of the slave trade. And I think there's sort of an unstated assumption in that work. that the vast majority of African captives landed in reasonable proximity in the Americas to where they ended up living and toiling under slavery. And basically, I think that assumption is incorrect. So my intervention into this academic conversation in the simplest terms has just been to say, actually, lots of people landed somewhere in the Americas only to be forced onto yet another ship for a lengthy journey within the Americas. And I'll talk a little bit about how I got into this work, because I think it helps explain or start an explanation of why I think this phase of the slave trade is important. As a graduate student, what I actually came to grad school wanting to study was the cultural encounters between Europeans and enslaved Africans in these colonies in the Americas, particularly in North America was where I was focusing. I wanted to think about how they interacted with one another, how they made sense of one another or failed to, how they borrowed from one another's beliefs, knowledge, ideas. But I wanted to ground that understanding in a sophisticated sense of who the enslaved people were. Scholars knew a great deal about the specific European settlers in various colonies and the diverse European cultures that they came from and brought with them to the Americas. But I felt like scholars often talked about the enslaved as generalized Africans, despite Africa being an enormous continent with incredible diversity. So I set about reading everything I could about the roots of the slave trade to various colonies to try to get a more precise understanding of which Africans we were talking about at particular places and times, to ground my sort of cultural study of people's interactions and the hybrid cultures that resulted. So reading histories of slavery in various places and reading histories of the slave trade, I kept running into a problem. There was something that just didn't add up for me. Slavery and enslaved people were virtually everywhere in the Americas, but the transatlantic slave trade seemed much more concentrated. People were delivered to the same relatively small number of ports in the Americas over and over again, and yet the institution of slavery and their lives played out in a much wider range of places. So I started hypothesizing that there had to be a dispersal trade, a dispersal forced migration within the Americas. And so that was my hypothesis. That was my research question. How did that work? How extensive was it? And what I found, I have to say, ended up exceeding even my own wildest expectations. And it became the subject of my dissertation in graduate school, and eventually the subject of the book that I published in 2014 called Final Passages. And it turns out that this intra-American trafficking of people after the Middle Passage was enormous. One of the first steps that I took research-wise, and this is just a map sort of giving you a sense of these intra-American movements, people arriving. Often what we're talking about is arrivals in the Caribbean, which was a major, major destination of the transatlantic slave trade, and then people enduring subsequent journeys from there. And one of my first steps to try to get a handle of this and just sort of figure out what were the major routes was to go through historic port records. It looked like this. And from that work, I ended up documenting more than 7,500 individual voyages that carried groups of enslaved people from one place to another in the Americas. So I'm not expecting that people will actually be able to decipher this record that I've put up on the screen here, but it's kind of like a old-timey spreadsheet. It's each row on this port record represents the arrival of a ship, and a naval officer in a Virginia port writing down the arrival of that ship. So from left to right, we've got a column with the date, then the name of the ship, then who the captain of the ship was. And if you look over towards the third column on the right, there's a column labeled general cargo, where they described what was delivered, or in the case of the second voyage down, who was delivered. You probably can't make it out, but this vessel is arriving from Barbados in the Caribbean, and it says that the general cargo was sundry Barbados goods and 8 slaves. So we've got people being delivered to Virginia here. Altogether, the 7,000 plus individual entries like this that I found in various records from throughout the colonies shows hundreds of thousands of enslaved people being moved again after they survived the Middle Passage. 250,000 people put on ships in the British Caribbean and delivered to colonies in the French and Spanish Caribbean or surrounding mainland colonies. 75,000 people moved from British Caribbean colonies to British North American colonies. Nearly 1 in 5 people who arrived in the British Caribbean on a transatlantic slave ship were then put on another ship and moved out of the British Caribbean on that ship. And the British Caribbean being one of the major destinations of the transatlantic slave trade. So the fact that 1 in 5 of those people then quickly moved on somewhere else forcibly in the slave trade is remarkable. And it's a similar picture looking at this from the North American perspective. Nearly 1 in 5 enslaved people arrived in North America indirectly via the Caribbean rather than directly from Africa. And if we look beyond just British colonies, we're talking about millions of people who landed in one port somewhere in the Americas, only to move on again. Now, why does this matter? We already knew that some 12.5 million people were forced onto ships in West Africa for forced removal to the Americas in the slave trade. So what does it change to add this intra-American dimension to the trade and migration? And what I'm going to do with most of the time tonight is sort of highlight 3 things. And the first of those, I want to talk about the experiences of the enslaved people on these ships. So we've already learned about the horrors of the Atlantic crossing. Lots of scholarship had been done on that. For enslaved people, the crowding, the filth, the rampant illness, the terrible mortality. Roughly 1 in 5 people who boarded slave ships on the African coast did not survive the journey across the Atlantic. We knew a fair bit about that. The scale of the intercolonial slave trade, I would suggest, though, reminds us that the Middle Passage was just one phase in a longer journey for many. As awful as the Middle Passage was, it's only part of the story. Within Africa, people endured long journeys just to reach the coast and the slave ships that carried them to the Americas. And then in the Americas, many people endured further journeys soon after surviving the transatlantic slave trade. One rare survivor managed to write about the experience, Olaudah Equiano, pictured here, and he described the transition from the transatlantic to the intercolonial slave trade in this way. He said that he landed in Barbados originally and described awaiting a second shipment to Virginia in, quote, a merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, end quote. And he said that this layover lasted, in his memory, a few days. I believe it could not be above a fortnight. And the significance of this kind of quick turnaround, I think, is that it's crucial to understand that captives embarked on these intra-American journeys, often still reeling from the Atlantic crossing. They were sick, they were malnourished, often traumatized. And the conditions on these intra-American vessels were again appalling. They typically involved fewer captives on board, but the ships were also much smaller and they were often crowded with trade goods. So the conditions were terribly cramped. We don't have many ship plans from this time period. It's not the way ships were constructed from written plans, generally speaking. But I did find a letter from one Virginia merchant writing to another merchant and describing a vessel that he wanted to have constructed for trade between the Caribbean and Virginia. And what he said about the ship, his name's Charles Stewart, he said that ideally such a ship would have a 9-foot hold in depth he's talking about, and that it would have 3 feet, 3 inches clear between decks. So a 9-foot hold in total depth, but divided into 3 sections, each of which would be 3 feet deep. And then he went on to say, such a vessel could bring slaves here between decks. So he's talking about packing people into these 3-foot tall spaces for, a journey that would probably take a month from the Caribbean up to Virginia on a sailboat. Not surprisingly, mortality was horrific on such voyages. In percentage terms, as best I could determine from the port records in different places that I studied, about 5% of the people who got on one of these voyages died. That sounds like less mortality, as bad as it is, than the transatlantic slave trade. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the voyages were often much shorter in this intra-American trade. So if you factor in time to calculate a rate of mortality, this is even more deadly. People were dying astonishingly fast. And I think that's because the danger here is cumulative. The point isn't to compare the transatlantic and intra-American trades and say which was worse. They're both horrific. And captives experienced one and then quickly had to experience the other. So this just compounds the risk. It compounds the murderous nature of this business. In addition to thinking about these shipboard experiences, another significance of factoring in this intra-American phase of the slave trade is thinking about profitability for the traders. It changes our assessments of what was gained at the expense of captives' freedom and suffering, and often their very lives. And historians have long debated how profitable the slave trade was. Caribbean historian, who later became the Prime Minister of Trinidad in the mid-20th century, Eric Williams, famously argued that the profits of the slave trade had fueled British industrialization. But economists spent a lot of time countering that argument, doing comparisons of the prices paid for African captives on the African coast and the prices received for those people in the Americas. Especially if one factors in shipping costs, many economists have argued that the profits were actually small compared to the overall economies of these slave trading empires. Slave trade was profitable, these economists argue, but not much more so than normal trades, and they made up a relatively small part of the broader economies. But I think that adding the intra-American phase of the slave trade into the picture complicates things a bit. The profits were more extensive than a simplistic comparison of the price paid for a human being in Africa and the price received for her in America might suggest. Most simply, there were additional rounds of resale and profit. People weren't just bought and sold once in the Atlantic slave trade. They were bought and sold serially by different merchants, each of whom took their profit. And economists have mostly only considered one round of that buying and selling, the transatlantic. With successive rounds of traders taking these profits, it really has to expand the way we think about what was gained. And perhaps more important, a main argument that I've made in my book and in other research is that the intercolonial phase of the slave trade was very much entangled with other forms of commerce. Transatlantic slave traders, at least for that voyage from Africa to the Americas, typically carried only human captives for trade. Intra-American traders, the ones that I study more, often mix the commerce in human captives with the trading of goods. And this is the really key point. Many of these traders felt that engaging in the slave trade facilitated their commerce in goods. Especially in southern colonies, many merchants considered slave trading vital to building their merchant networks for profit from any kind of trade. To give you just one example, in North Carolina in 1749, there was a glut of shipping. Lots of ships in the port, not many goods for export to fill those ships. So traders were in a little bit of a pickle. And a merchant there named James Murray, who's not the guy pictured on this slide, just because I don't know of a portrait of him that survives. This is another prolific slave trader who went on to play an important role in the American Revolution and served in Congress. His painting hangs in the US Senate. So I threw him up there, Henry Lawrence. But anyway, James Murray, this North Carolina merchant, wrote to partners of his in the Caribbean, warning them about this glut of shipping in Carolina. And he told them not to come He recommended not sending ships at all to North Carolina. But then he added a very interesting caveat. He said, quote, "If necessity obliges you to come, I advise you to bring instead of rum and sugar, some cheap Negroes, but not old ones. If anything brings a loading here, they will," end quote. So in other words, having enslaved people to sell in North Carolina was the surest way to acquire goods to export from North Carolina. Selling people would bring trade partners to the table when nothing else could, in Murray's estimation. In that environment, where do the profits of slave trading end and the profits of other commerce, the commerce in goods, begin? You can't separate the two, Murray's saying. And it wasn't just individual merchants talking about individual transactions who understood the slave trade as uniquely valuable in this way. The idea of the slave trade as a gateway commerce to broader commercial engagements in goods shaped British imperial policy in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm just going to play an animated map here to give you a sense of the geography of this trade while I talk about this a little bit. One of the biggest surprises to me from my work in the port records that resulted in the data that powers this animated map, counting up ships and counting the people carried on those ships, one of the biggest surprises was that the biggest branch of this slave trade from British colonial ports turned out to go to places outside the British Empire. I thought I was going to be studying the trafficking of people from British Caribbean colonies to the British North American mainland. But British traders actually sent far more enslaved people from the British Caribbean to Spanish colonies and to French colonies. This raised a huge question for me. Why would the British supply valuable labor to power colonial economies to enemy colonies? And what I learned, that led me to a different kind of research in the letters of merchants and government records talking about trade regulations. And what I learned was that the British government supported British traders in selling people outside the empire because they considered this trafficking of people to Spanish colonies a great way to facilitate exports of British manufactured goods as well. British imperial officials throughout the colonial period looked for opportunities to expand markets for British manufacturers. And Spanish colonies were like the holy grail for them. Very attractive markets because they were so prosperous. In particular, they were flush with silver from mines, newly discovered mines in Mexico and Peru. Meanwhile, Spanish colonies also suffered chronic shortages of European goods, of textiles, of dishes, of tools. The challenge for the British was how to reach that unmet Spanish-American demand for manufactured goods, because Spain prohibited trade with its colonies by foreigners. And this is where the slave trade comes in. It held great promise in the minds of British policymakers and traders, because the slave trade was the one trade for which the Spanish granted exemptions to their trade restrictions and allowed foreign merchants in. Trading enslaved people could then get British traders in, and once there, they hoped they could engage in commerce in British manufactured goods on the side, because there was so much need in Spanish America. In general, British policymakers, just like the Spanish, didn't allow foreign trade with their colonies. They wanted to keep it exclusive to British traders. But they strongly encouraged this intercolonial trade that mixed slave trafficking with trading manufactured goods. As one British strategist explained it, trade from Jamaica, he argued, or from Jamaica, quote, "A trade was opened with the Spaniards and successfully carried on for Negroes and other merchandise, whereby great quantities of the manufactures of Great Britain were yearly vended," end quote. And despite the fact that slave trading was seen as essential for permission to access the Spanish ports, the same official went on to explain that the trade carried on for Negroes was likewise the least branch of their commerce, end quote. So they engaged in slave trading to get in, but they actually did more business in trading goods than in trading people. And this went on for a long time. A century later, British policymakers were talking about this in very similar ways, defending the slave trade against the emerging abolition movement. Another policymaker explained the problem with abolishing the slave trade from his perspective, saying, quote, "A trade to the Spanish Main," meaning Spanish American colonies, "for British manufacturers is covered wholly by a few slaves, and the trade dependent altogether on that share in the assortment. You have to have the enslaved people on board to get permission to enter, and then you can trade manufactured goods." So here again, where do the profits of slave trading end and the profits of other commerce begin? And I want to underscore here that we're talking about manufacturing. We're talking about the profits of the burgeoning manufacturing sector of Great Britain in the early decades of the Industrial Revolution. So the economic significance of expanding this manufacturing exporting trade could not be more significant. And the last thing I'll mention about the profits of the slave trade extending further than we might think, further than just the price paid for an individual and the price received for that individual, is thinking about the development of colonial towns themselves, especially the ones that served as kind of the hubs of this slave trade, with people coming in and then being rerouted elsewhere. In a separate article that I published more recently than my book, I examined the slave trade's importance to the economy of colonial Charleston, or Charlestown, as they called it in the colonial period. Charleston was the port in North America that saw the largest number of ships and people arrive directly from Africa. And from there, people were rerouted to many places up and down the North American coast and further inland. And I argue that the slave trade was big business in Charleston, even for people who were not the buyers and sellers of captives. The influx of all these people, vessels carrying hundreds of people at a time, in what were cities of just a few thousand people in colonial America. These were not big places. That meant big business. Captives would need provisions. Traders would buy clothing for the captives. They would pay for medical treatments for people to prepare them for sale. Planters who came to buy captives needed lodging. They conducted other business while they were in town to purchase laborers for their plantations. So innkeepers, local farmers, fishmongers, porters, doctors and nurses, all of these people saw surges of business when slave ships came in and profited indirectly from the slave trade, while the slave traders themselves profited more directly. Okay, but enough about profits. The last main reason that I'll mention for why the intercolonial phase of the slave trade was vitally important is that it really helped shape the African diaspora in the Americas. It completely changed, or at least shook up sort of who went where in the slave trade. Patterns in the transatlantic slave trade tended to connect certain West African regions with particular parts of the Americas. But the complex patterns of dispersal in the slave trade within the Americas kind of rerouted these streams of migration, albeit forced migration. Sometimes this is in terms of ethnicity. Some of you may have seen news stories in the last year or two about researchers at 23andMe who've done analysis of DNA samples submitted by thousands of African Americans for what they can tell us about the African roots of the African American population. And the DNA researchers found that DNA of people in the United States suggests origins in a much broader range of African regions, a more diverse population, in other words, than studying the transatlantic portion of the slave trade alone might lead one to expect. There's more sort of overlapping, drawing from wider range of regions in Africa. And the solution that these DNA researchers came up with is that the intra-American slave trade can help explain how people got shifted around in more complex ways. And they cited my work for that. So score one footnote, I guess. But the impacts of the Intra-American trafficking on shaping the diaspora went well beyond actual ethnicity. Um, there were also patterns with regard to gender and age that I think are really striking in this intra-American portion of the trafficking that shaped Black life in the Americas. So to give just one example of this, slaveholders in northern colonies often received children through the intercolonial slave trade. And this is also a reminder that there were no free states in the North in the colonial period. All of the colonies practiced slavery, and slavery was legal everywhere until after the American Revolution. So for example, in 1748, a Philadelphia trader named Robert Ellis told his trade partners in the Caribbean that, quote, "If you should have a ship with Negroes this spring, you may send 20 or 30 young boys and girls to Philadelphia." And this was a pattern I saw in a lot of these merchants' letters, that northern merchants requested specifically children in the slave trade. And it's a striking contrast to the plantation colonies, where plantation owners tended to prefer adults. And the northern colonists preferred enslaved children, it turned out, in order to train them for domestic service and to train them to specialize artisan crafts, to be bakers, to be jewelers, to be shoemakers, things like that. And for the development of African American cultures, I think such a skewed age pattern in the forced migration has really profound implications. Sold without their elders, these children being delivered to northern colonies were typically settling in white households with few, if any, of their elders, few, if any, other Africans. So they were much more fully cut off from the cultures of their birth than was true for enslaved people who landed in plantation colonies. Given such conditions, I think it becomes less surprising that many of the earliest African-American Christian preachers, many of the earliest African-American English language poets and other writers, such as Phillis Wheatley, who's pictured on this slide, emerged in northern colonies, even though there were significantly less African and people of African descent in those northern colonies. There were fewer Africans present, but their circumstances forced them to assimilate much more fully and much more quickly. Whereas in southern colonies, where larger numbers of enslaved people arrived directly from Africa, and with many more adults among them, we see more evidence of continuities with African cultures. Styles of dance, instruments like the one pictured in this well-known painting, the banjo, which is an African instrument recreated thanks to the memories of enslaved people of instruments they remembered from West Africa, clothing styles. There's much more languages. There's much more culturally that's retained of Africa in the cultures created by enslaved people in the southern colonies. But I have to admit that if I have a critique of my own book, it's that I couldn't do more to explore these kinds of cultural impacts of the intercolonial slave trade on the lives and cultures of enslaved people. It simply would have required a completely different kind of research and different kinds of sources than those that I used to study the trafficking of people, which is kind of ironic considering it's how I started. I was interested in these cultural questions to begin with and felt like I just couldn't answer them because we didn't know enough about the routes that delivered people to the Americas. So I have to hope that my work on the slave trade can facilitate other scholars researching the cultures that enslaved people in the Americas constructed, and that they can approach that topic in a more informed way by understanding more about these patterns in the slave trade and how they shape populations in different places. And that takes me to the last topic I want to mention today, which is another current project that I'm engaged in, which is called the Intra-American Slave Trade Database. With grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, I took the database that I compiled for my own research of 7,600 and some odd slave trading voyages, and I put it online as a searchable online public resource. And that was done in collaboration, not just my own work, but bringing in collaboration with a bunch of other scholars researching other empires and other parts of the Americas. We expanded its coverage so that with our most recent editions, just last month, we're now up to 27,000 voyages appearing in the database. So it's telling you there that there's 27,000 entries. So kind of like that port record that we looked at, the handwritten port record, each row here is a single voyage of a ship with a place of embarkation for enslaved people, a place of disembarkation, other information if we know it. And we've actually got 200 variables of information for many of these individual voyages. You can click on any entry and open up more details about it. It's all freely available online for other researchers to not have to go gather all these port records the way I did and other researchers have done to contribute to this database. People can move on to other questions about enslaved people's experiences. The website's also available in Spanish and Portuguese translations to facilitate access for scholars working in other places around the Atlantic world. We'd like to add more languages, but it's very time-consuming and expensive to do the translations. So anyway, my great hope is that this will facilitate future research on the African diaspora and how patterns in the slave trade continue to shape the lives of enslaved people on the ground and the cultures that they contributed to in various places around the Americas. So in conclusion, I just want to suggest something about the longer term significance of all this trading of human beings. This commodification of people, treating people as goods for trade, was one of the sites, I would argue, where racism was constructed and created in colonial America, where racism became endemic to American society. These thousands of shipments, some big and some small, carrying captives to ports all across the Americas, brought many more people into contact with the exchange of people as property. And I'm not just talking about the buyers and sellers of people here, but also the port officials who created the ledgers that I've studied, the dock workers who loaded and unloaded ships, the printers and readers of advertisements like this one that appeared in newspapers announcing human beings for sale, the sailors and ship captains, the nurses and doctors who nurse people back to health only to facilitate their sale. All of these various people were drawn into the commerce in human beings. And the step from viewing people as commodities suitable for trade to seeing them as a lesser type of human whose life was less important was a pretty small step. So as we struggle in modern times with the ongoing problem that Black lives are not treated as if they matter by our police, our courts, our prisons, by us collectively, I think this history is important context for understanding the depth and the roots of that problem. It is very, very deep historical roots, and we have a lot of work to do to understand those roots if we hope to uproot them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. And maybe you should stop your screen.
Yeah. Stop my share here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, that amazing and informative and moving talk. We are now going to talk a little bit, I, and Professor Gina Dent, and then open it up. I'd like to invite people who have questions to please put them into the Q&A, and I'll be keeping an eye on them and voicing them to our panelists. I wanted to start, Greg, by what you were talking about just at the end of your presentation, when you talk about the tensions between commodification and humanity, because that is really getting at the crux, not only of the brutal logic and problem of slavery itself, the treating of people as goods or things, but also at one of the dilemmas that your research has had to find a way through. On the one hand, you are an economic historian of slavery, who is turning to what you've called elsewhere the paper trail that commerce left, that we have these ledgers, records, ships manifestos, bills of sale, all of these things. And we have them precisely because of the extent to which slavery was considered to be trade. On the other side, we have slavery as a human event, an inhuman event with profoundly human consequences. And I think the work you've done has had to really find ways to grapple with what to do with a paper trail in order to have it tell not only the economic story, but also the human story. And I'm really curious if you could talk about, as a historian, first, what it was like to encounter these kinds of documents in the archive, right? What is your sort of subjective experience of touching, working with, having to enter this world? And secondly, as a historian, what kind of framework did you end up building around these documents so that you could read them not just for the story they give us or the facts they give us, but also, I think, for the story that they cannot tell? So I'm really asking you to talk a little bit about the historian's dilemma and the tools that you used both in the book project or in the database.
That's such a great question. I'm in great danger here of not talking just a little about this. I could rattle on forever. So I have to be careful how I answer because it's a huge question, and a really important one. And you're touching also on something that's been a significant divide in the field of slave trade studies, is that there have been many scholars have done this really quantitative work that's been foundational to the field of just answering those nuts and bolts questions of how many people, where did they go, how bad was the mortality, right? How many people got on ships and how many people got off ships? There's a lot of work. And then the economic questions that go along with this. How extensive were the profits of this, right? You need to know something about scale to assess that profitability. And then on the other hand, there have been scholars who have often been quite critical of people taking those kinds of quantitative approaches, who say, no, that's the wrong story to tell. And those are the wrong questions to ask. We need to shift the focus onto the enslaved people themselves, what they endured in this traffic, their resistance to this traffic, the cultures they created in the Americas. And when I started my research on this, I was a little bit naive about that. I wasn't aware of that whole history of sort of how fraught that, and in doing the reading for the project and as a graduate student, I became increasingly aware that this was a divided field that I was entering into. And for me, that was a big dilemma. In addition to sort of the moral dilemma you're talking about, there was also a sort of professional piece, and it bothered me that the field was so divided in this way, because I saw the work of scholars on both sides of that divide as vitally important. I felt like the quantitative work was really foundational to just knowing, what are we talking about here? Like, we need to know the scale. The scale does matter. And I also found very compelling the arguments by scholars saying, if we just talk numbers all the time, it's cold, it's impersonal, and it's easy to lose sight of the devastating human impacts of this. What people suffered, not just how many people lived or died. I mean, it's an important but a very simplistic and sort of crude assessment of trauma and damage. But studies that have grounded that work much more in the cultures of people, and then what would it mean if you were from that culture, if you believe certain things, if you thought certain ways, to be put on a ship and uprooted from where you are from, separated from kin, separated from your ancestors, separated from landscapes that might be sacred. What trauma does that do? What does that mean, right? And all of a sudden, the levels on which this is an evil and damaging commerce become much more profound. And to me, both of those things mattered a great deal. And so the great research challenge and writing challenge for me in approaching my own book was trying to weave those two stories together. And so one of the things that I emphasize a lot in the book is that the slave trade is always two things at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to keep both of them in mind to understand what's happening. It is a trade and it is a migration, right? It's a forced migration. It's not voluntary, but it's a migration, right? And so people are enduring this as a travel experience and an uprooting of their life from one place to another. But to understand why that's happening, you do have to reckon with the fact that it is also trade, right? The merchants are making decisions, not planning a migration of people. They are planning a business venture. And that means they sometimes move people across routes that would make no sense if someone were planning how to travel from one place to another. You know, they wouldn't follow the routes that sometimes the traders took people on. But commercial opportunities lead merchants to ship people from, you know, Senegal to Jamaica, and then merchants who come down from North Carolina delivering turpentine and timber purchase captives in exchange and ship them from Jamaica to North Carolina. It's a convoluted, wacky route for people to travel. It's driven by the economy, not by a migration. So you have to understand sort of both perspectives to really grasp the full significance of what's happening. And so I spend a lot of time in the book trying to sort of flip the lens from one perspective to the other, so that readers don't lose track of this as a migration experience, a coercive migration experience, but also understand the why is this happening because of what these traders are thinking about.
Thank you so much. That's such a rich answer. And before I turn it over to Gina for a question, I just wanted to flag, maybe because our audience will be interested in asking a question about this, that one of the ironies of the work that you have done is that you are using the very logic of abstraction and quantification, right, that underwrote the treatment of people as goods. So you're using quantification to actually tell a story that can help us see the human side of the slave trade. And I think that is a really compelling example of how it is that we engage with the records of the past. They don't speak for themselves, or the story they tell is one we actually have to somehow surface and recontextualize. And you're using not only the tools you've just described, but of course the tools of the digital humanities, which have let you work with that paper trail and all the ways in which it invites us to imagine individual cases, an individual entry, a smudge, an erasure, an incomplete entry, right? There are all of these things at the level of what can be recorded that make us want, I think, to know more, to fill in, to imagine the fundamental impossibility of knowing everything. And so I think that any project, even one as vast as presenting this extraordinary amount of really crucial data for how we tell the history of slavery, is also in a way haunted by the impossibility of the
Absolutely,
data.
Absolutely. And this really speaks to the other half of your question, which was sort of about my sort of more personal subjective experience of encountering these documents. It's incredibly uncomfortable to work with these documents. They're dehumanizing in the extreme, and there are scholars who've made the arguments, who've been critical of the kind of work that I do in doing this quantitative work, arguing that because these documents are the product of treating people in this inhumane way, treating people as commodities for trade, that there's like a taint, it's tainted work somehow by that gross commodification. And my response to that would be, well, I appreciate that, where that critique is coming from. To my mind, we have little choice if we are to recover anything of the stories of the people subjected to this trafficking. Because, I mean, obviously I would prefer to work from autobiographical sources like Equianos for all the work that I do. But those documents are incredibly, incredibly rare. The vast, vast majority of the millions of people forced to endure the slave trade were never given an opportunity to write down their stories and have those stories preserved for posterity. And so we have little choice, like with studying so many disadvantaged people throughout history, we have little choice but to work with the sources left by the powerful and try to, as historians say, read them against the grain for what they can tell us about other people that we're interested in studying in the past. And I think that applies to these kinds of port records and economic records. You know, other scholars of slavery, you know, would look at, say, plantation owners' accounts and their descriptions of interacting with enslaved people and read those for what they can tell us about enslaved people's lives, their motivations, their resistance, right? They flip it around, use planter records to get at the perspectives of the enslaved. I think we have to do the same thing with these trade documents, is try to filter through the bias of these traders who view people as goods to be profited from and look for what can these documents tell us and what can the data they contain tell us about what enslaved people endured and how they shaped the Americas.
Thank you so much. Gina, Professor Gina Dent, I know has some questions as well.
Hi, both of you, and thank you so much for that presentation, Greg, and for all the work. I'm going to start, I guess, right in where you all are. I have a lot to say, so I'm just going to give sort of a setup for many of the questions I have, which I don't think I'll get to all of them because I know there are many other people waiting to ask questions. I think I'm listening to the part about what it was like for you to do, to be with those materials and to have done this for so many years. And I have to say, I thank you for that because I don't think I could have done it. And, you know, I learned a lot about this from being with students. Over the years when I've been teaching about slavery, I've had several students have to walk out of the room and come to me later and say, you know, I had learned about slavery before, I've been reading about slavery, but I've never had a Black professor teach me about slavery. Suddenly they heard things differently. And I was teaching it from a different perspective because I was teaching it from a Black studies perspective, which takes a very different set of points of view in relationship to those materials. And of course, this is not, there's no singular way of doing this from Black studies. And of course, now we're dealing with several eras of Black studies. But it seems to me that it's important to open on to these questions now because these questions are now of your research are now very much in our everyday debates. They're in our debates about reparations. They're in our debates about prison abolition. They're in our debates about DEI and whether or not it's sufficient, and people are suddenly recognizing that it isn't. They're in our debates about ADOS, which is the movement to recognize American descendants of slavery over and against other people from the diaspora. They're in the challenge to CRT and critical race theory. They're in the 1619 project and the relationship to that. So there are so very many ways in which these questions are being taken up in the public in new ways, in ways that I really never imagined. So it's been taking me back to thinking about all the different ways in which we enter these conversations. And when you were talking with Vilashini about the kind of two strands in slaves trade scholarship, or the two strands in scholarship of slavery, which is a little bit of a different thing to say, I was thinking that you also referenced Eric Williams and of course other strands of thinking about slavery. And most of the time, in my experience of having been trained into Black studies, I was in a complicated relationship to history. In African-American studies, history has been the discipline that has sort of been at the center, much like in African studies, anthropology has been very much the discipline at the center. And so history has always been a site of contestation and also has been for me a difficult object. And I I was thinking about a phrase, which I happen to hear today in a very different context, that comes from an odd source, which is Percy Bysshe Shelley. And the phrase is, we must learn to imagine what we know. Now, I could tell you more about the context in which we were discussing that phrase today. It had to do with talking about post-colonial studies and Africa and fields that seem far removed from talking about Shelley. But I was in an environment of people who are unafraid to look also at those materials and the way in which they have also influenced us. In other words, I, as a Black person teaching Black studies, don't only have one intellectual lineage that I'm leaning on. However, when thinking about that phrase, we must learn to imagine what we know. I was reflecting very much on knowing we'd be talking tonight. And then thinking about some of the choices that you made, even in your presentation. For example, I didn't recognize every image that you used, and maybe I would if I spent more time, but I think I recognized the Maynell image, which was an oil painting, which was then not contemporaneous to the ships that you're talking about. I noticed that your choices of other images, even the posters for escaped slaves, those choices were made in ways that seem to try to avoid some of the ugliest and most documentary styles of evidence. And so I wonder if you can talk about how you're using the visual to manage the problems that we've been talking about. And I also would love to hear how you think about addressing what else you feel you have to do in the world in order to counterbalance this work.
Wow, those are such great thoughts. And the quotation you raised about having to imagine what we know definitely resonates with a real methodological debate in among historians of slavery. That I'm thinking in particular of like Marisa Fuentes's work, arguing that we have to sort of take these, because the references to enslaved people in the documents left mostly by slaveholding people are so fragmentary that we have to be willing to sort of take some interpretive leaps to fill in the gaps of what is known in the story. And traditionally, as historians, we are taught not to go beyond our sources, right? That the documents are only linked to the past, and so we can only interpret what's in those documents rather than try to sort of elaborate from them. And scholars working in disciplines related to history have often been a little more open to those kinds of methodologies, and so it's a sort of a lively debate right now among historians of sort of how far down that road one can go. And for me, I think where I come down on it is I'm quite open to some of that speculation. For me, a historical methodology is that one makes clear where they're engaging in that speculation by the way they talk about what is in the sources, and then what interpretive leaps they're making, sort of being clear to the reader how firm ground we think we're on as historians as we make various conjectures from the sources. But I also do think that it's the foundation for being able to make sort of educated, informed interpretations like that is rooted in evidence. And so I'm sort of committed to starting from documentary sources for those speculations. On the question about images, it's really interesting. I don't think I was thinking about the images as holistically as your question is asking me to think about them, but rather thinking about images to illustrate a particular point at a particular moment, right? What image can I use in this moment? And the Meynell image that you point to, you're quite right to point out that it's a little bit decontextualized the way I've used it there. That was a watercolor done. I think it's a watercolor. It might be an oil painting. I think it's a watercolor. But in any case, it's done on a captured slave ship in the 19th century that was taking people to Brazil. So it was actually a transatlantic vessel, not one of these intra-American vessels. And it's done in a slightly later time period than most of what I was talking about today. The reason that I use that particular image actually is because it's somewhat unique. It's in being less schematic. The famous image of the slave ship Brooks that people have seen, it's on the cover of virtually every slave trade, book published, and it gets used a lot of. It's a schematic image of a sort of cross section of a ship showing all the people lined up to show how people were packed aboard these vessels is the most common image that's used, but it's very sort of impersonal. It's a diagram rather than an image of people, but also it's only people. And the Meynell image shows people sitting on top of barrels. And so I was using the image in the particular part of my talk that I was to capture that sense of the relationship between slave trading and the commerce in goods, right? That these people are being put into the holds of ships alongside trade goods, sharing space with those goods, but also in the mindset of the traders and empires, these two modes of commerce are very much entangled. We like to think of them as separate, right? That was the great victory of the abolitionists, is that they convinced us that these were two separate things. People could not be moved as trade goods. That's inhumane. It's murderous. And in a way, I think that mindset shapes, for good reasons, the way we look at the slave trade now. But to understand what's happening and what's at stake for the merchants and the profits gained, I think it's actually important to recover that sense of how, for them, this was all integrated, and they saw one kind of trafficking facilitating another. So that's why I particularly brought that image in. And I think the newspaper ads and things like that are quite striking too, because they often, they capture that sense as well. And that often the advertisements, especially from these intercolonial trafficking ventures, they advertise people in the same advertisement that they'll say they have rum for sale or sugar for sale or other kinds of imported goods. And it captures for me this sense of the way slave trading was integrated into the economy in a way that I think makes much more far-reaching the implications of what was gained at the expense of enslaved people's freedom. So connecting to like reparations debates and things like that, I think the implications of this are really important for thinking about the scale to which the American economy was built around slavery. It's not a side story to the story of American history or the history of the American economy. It's fundamental to it. So for me, there are very profound connections between these issues of reparations and this phase in particular of the slave trade.
Yeah, and of course historians are, I'm thinking of Catherine Hall and Peter Hudson and lots of people who are doing work now also specifically to think about that. I just have a small follow-up, which is that you were talking about historians and how you deal with the record and how you deal with the archive, but I'm also interested always in the question of not speculation. That Marissa Fuentes, of course, was trained by Saidiya Hartman partly, and so she also has that in her training. But even without speculative relationships to history, there's a question of the error or of the veracity of the documents, or the missing nature of documents, tax frauds, exaggerations, all kinds of things that which we know humans do. So how that's one of the reasons why so many scholars who are not historians but come from a Black studies perspective where we pay attention to this history tend to have conversations that go beyond always what's in the record, to partly try to talk about subjectivity, to talk about ways in which knowledge is supported, which things look like knowledge, which things look like a record. So I just wondered if you would say a little bit more about what you did find, or places where things felt a little strange to you, or how you deal with the question of the veracity or the reliability of the archive.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a number of things popping to my mind. I mean, one is that there's certain branches of this that are easier to study than others because of smuggling, right? So the French colonies, for example, like the Spanish, typically it was illegal, but they didn't grant exemptions for the slave trade in the same way. So they just barred all foreign commerce with their colonies. But there are sort of more descriptive sources where people describe smuggling between British colonies in the Caribbean and French colonies in the Caribbean as rampant. So we sort of know it was going on, but it can't be tracked in the same way with port records because it was all done illegally. And so people didn't leave the same kind of paper trails. And so for that, I relied on other kinds of sources. And then this was a place where I did do some of that kind of speculation that probably, makes some of the more traditional economic historians uncomfortable in thinking about. I tried to do some imagining of what does that mean for enslaved people to be smuggled across imperial borders rather than delivered through, the front door, so to speak. So thinking about, were people closed off in hidden parts of the ship, right? Literally and sealed in compartments, where people landed in the dark of night in out of the way harbors, and were there risks and dangers of that, of not having the infrastructure of ports. And so I on a very limited way, I tried at moments to sort of be a little bit speculative to get into some of those kinds of implications. Another thing that your comment made me think about is, I quoted Equiano in this talk, and use him extensively in the book as a point of evidence for this, one of these just very rare accounts where we have a person who may or may not have endured this trafficking as a captive, describing it in their own words, because of course Equiano's source is famously controversial, because there are a couple of documents outside of his narrative that suggest that he was born in the Americas rather than being born in Africa. To some degree, I sidestepped that issue because as an enslaved person in the Americas, he was owned by a merchant, not a plantation owner, and worked on some of these vessels as an enslaved sailor. And so some of what he describes actually is what he witnessed working in the trade rather than enduring it as a captive. And I would argue that what he describes, even if he wasn't born in Africa, I happen to still think he was, but even if he wasn't, he's describing enduring it as a captive from the perspective, it may be fictionalized, but of someone who was an eyewitness to the trade. And we have corroboration from that from independent sources. In fact, I've found in the port records that I've studied, the ship captain, the ship name of the ship that he says he worked on in his narrative, and see it moving enslaved people. So I've approached his source in that way, but I think it also is a great example to bring up. And I talk to students about this when I introduce them to this controversy over how should we see Equiano, is a lot of historians quickly have gravitated to these other sources. It's a baptismal record and some other kind of record that say that he was born in North America rather than having been born in Africa. And a lot of historians have been quick to then say, okay, well, we can't use his account of surviving the slave trade. And it's striking to me that there's also another source that says he was born in Africa, and it's his autobiography, right? Like, why is this baptismal record given much more credence than him saying, this is the story of my life, right? and I think it's, it's because he's an abolitionist, he's arguing against the slave trade. So people, want to argue that makes him suspect in some way. But I would argue we have, evidence on both sides. And so, and it's sometimes presented as if it doesn't count what he says about his own life. And I find that deeply problematic.
I know it could go on, but I know we're getting our questions in, right, Vilashini? So we have some.
Thank you so much, Greg, and Gina, for that exchange. I think that there are a few clusters of questions in the chat, so I'm going to put them, group them a little bit, and then you can respond. There seems to be a cluster that wants to know more about the nature of the trade. Were there, for example, any Black slave traders? There was an earlier question, I don't know if you already answered this, Greg, about whether there were people who had been captive and were on ships but did not disembark but remained on ships in some sort of working capacity, and whether that constituted a sort of, I think the person was asking, a tiny fraction percentage of those who did not arrive. So the question about Black slave traders, the question about whether it was a case that there were slaves who captives who then worked and remained on board ships, and finally a question about what forms of resistance there were to captivity or to capture, whether at the moment of capture, I assume during the course of these voyages, or how enslaved folks coped with the losses and traumas of these events. And I think that's something you've touched on before as well, and thinking about the kinds of cultural practices that were transferred, mixed, blended, sustained, even in the midst of these wrenching and violent losses. So if you want to think about the composition of the trade, I think people would like that.
Those are all very interesting questions. So in terms of the sort of composition of the trade, at the level of the sort of investors in it, who the merchants were, who these traffickers were, there's very little evidence of any Black participation in the trade at that level. Of course, within Africa, there are coastal traders, Black coastal traders, who are selling enslaved people to Europeans. But in terms of this phase of the slave trade in the Americas that I'm studying, very little evidence. I found one case of one voyage where a captain of a ship was described as being a free Black individual out of, all these thousands of voyages. And I don't have any case, and they didn't own, that they're not the owner of the ship. They're just, the employee who captains the ship. So even in that case, how much control they had over what they're engaged in is a very open question. I don't know of any cases of the owners of vessels being Black individuals. But for the sailors, that would be a different story, right? And the Equiano case that I was talking about is different. There were many, slavery wasn't just a plantation institution, although that was the sort of main driving force behind it. There were many enslaved people who worked in maritime occupations. For their owners, it was also an important mode of work for the small numbers of people in the slavery era who were able to acquire freedom in some way. Very rarely could they become landowners, and maritime work was one of the few wage-paying types of jobs in colonial America. There are not a lot of things one can do for wages. And so craft professions in cities, and then maritime work of various kinds, loading and unloading ships, working as sailors on ships. So there were quite a large number of Black sailors in this world who worked for wages on these ships. And a lot of these ships, didn't specialize in slave trading, but sometimes engaged in it. And so there would have often been Black sailors aboard these vessels. In terms of whether many people were just sort of kept aboard a vessel that was engaged in slave trading to become these maritime workers, that's not my sense from the sources of how this usually happened. I think usually, like Equiano's story is instructive here. I think like that he arrives in the Caribbean, he's purchased by a merchant, does various work for that merchant in the Caribbean colony of Montserrat. And then when he becomes kind of a trusted good worker, at that point, the merchant decides to use him at some point when one of his sailing ships is short of workers. And I think that was more typical because for a merchant, it was sort of a risky thing to put an enslaved person on one of these ships that's moving around the Atlantic world, because that's going to open up possibilities for escape. And so I think most merchants were pretty careful about who they assign that role to, rather than just, you know, a captive recently arrived from Africa who's on one of these ships being put to work in a sailing capacity. It's also not clear whether they would have the needed skills for it. But it's quite possible. It wouldn't surprise me if it happened from time to time.
Thank you. There's another question which I think also goes to the composition and effects of the trade. Somebody asks about the relationship between the trade and other forms of unfree and free labor, for example, indenture or poor white labor, and how these different constituencies in the period you study are interacting, how we are thinking them comparatively, what the records might tell us differentially about these groups.
Sure, that's a really important question. I actually want to go back. I realized I missed, there were many prongs to the first question. I missed the one on resistance. I didn't touch on that. It's such an important question.
Go ahead first, yes.
Yeah, so the short answer would just be yes. Resistance at every phase in this process, right? Resistance to enslavement within Africa, very large amounts of documented resistance on the transatlantic slaving vessels. Interestingly, in the intra-American portion of the traffic, I found less evidence of cases of rebellion, which was a bit of a puzzle for me in my research. But my general conclusion was that there were two factors at play in that. One was that what a successful revolt would look like was harder for people to imagine in intra-American waters than, say, when the vessel's on the coast of Africa, where there's some hope of getting back off the ship to somewhere, right? If you don't have the skills to operate the ship, what does it do for you to take it over in a completely foreign environment, right? I think that was harder to imagine. So the better opportunity might have been earlier in the journey. But I think the more important factor is how debilitated people were from the horrid conditions in this traffic by the time they're in these intra-American waters, right? People are ill, people are dehydrated, people are malnourished, and rebellions were common on land. You know, in the Americas, there was resistance at every phase to enslavement, but it strikes me as a particularly difficult moment. That being said, there are some famous incidences of rebellion in the intra-American slave trade, including maybe the most famous slave ship rebellion of all, the Amistad. In the Steven Spielberg movie, that's presented as happening on a transatlantic slaving vessel, but it actually happens on an intra-American vessel. It was a vessel that was heading from Havana to a smaller port at the other end of Cuba when the enslaved people on board took it over. And they kept some of the crew alive and ordered them to sail the ship to Africa, but ended up adrift off the coast of North America, where they were captured by US naval vessel and brought into Connecticut. And that's what touched off the court case that is the centerpiece of that Spielberg movie. But that uprising actually occurs on an intra-American vessel. So there are some very dramatic incidents of resistance, but I didn't find as many examples of rebellion. So, and then, sorry, remind me again what the next question.
Well, there was a question about what kinds of resources did enslaved people find to cope with the loss, with the trauma, with the with what had been taken, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, and I had added to this question that that we might also add to this, thinking about things that have been retained, things that traveled over the course of these voyages, whether transatlantic or intra-American, and that persisted into cultural forms, a kind of like long continuum of the inheritance of forms of resistance. There is one other question maybe we could throw in and pair with this. I'm just trying to fit them all in, which is Susan Gilman's question about whether there is not some information, and she cites Phil Misevich, a digital humanities historian working on the database, and talking about the ways local languages that individual slaves might have spoken based on mistranslations of their names might have been one of these things that carried over and passed on. And so I think there's a question both about resistance and about inheritance of what remains and what the records have to tell us about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about sort of how people coped and survived is very much related to these questions about culture and cultural retention, and that they relied on each other. And I think Equiano's account is particularly moving on this. I mean, I come back to him a lot because he's just such a rare source for enslaved people's perspective on what was happening here. But I think one of the things that's really striking, he spends a lot of time, he was a boy, he was a child, as he describes it, during the transatlantic and then this intra-American crossing. And he describes a lot of comfort from people who spoke the same language as he did on the slave ship, and sort of you get a sense of older people looking out for this young boy, but he didn't know any of them before this experience of captivity and transport. These weren't people from like his home community. These were just other people who took him under their wing. And then when he's rerouted to Virginia, he describes that as a moment where it's just some of the people, a small number of them, make that journey, and that was very sort of disorienting and isolating because of the separation from some of the people who had comforted him earlier in his journey. And then when he moves within Virginia, he describes it as even further so. He says, I now lost the comfort of having anyone to talk to me who I could understand, I think is the phrase he uses. It's pretty close to a quote. And so I think that's a real window in terms of how people coped, right? That he forged these powerful bonds with people on the ship that were not people he knew beforehand. And then that also speaks to some of this cultural retention, right? That there were these sort of language communities, people sought out others with whom they could communicate. There's really interesting work that's been done on identity and how identity changes through the trade. Alex Bird has an amazing article on analyzing Igbo people from what's now southeastern Nigeria in the slave trade, and talking about how Igbo and various other terms that represent sort of Igbo speaking peoples in the New World, that wasn't an identity that would have made sense to people in Africa. That they were divided by various lines of political allegiance and stuff in Africa, but through the experience of the trade, because they shared a mutually intelligible language, it becomes a meaningful identity through the process of moving through the slave trade and in enslavement in the Americas, because they're a community of people who share language, who then can keep culture alive together, can use that common language for resistance. There's really interesting things that happen with regards to identity in this move from Africa to the Americas.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Yeah. Okay. I should touch on. There was also a question about comparing to things like indentured servitude, and I think that's a really important question to touch on, because there is this unfreedom that makes for similar statuses for some people of European descent who are under these servitude contracts with enslavement. But I think the slave trade points us to a really crucial distinction that it's very important to keep in mind. Because while there were aspects of unfreedom that are similar, the key the key distinction is that servants are still treated as members of society with a certain standing and rights, right? They can go into court, and they're under contract. For one thing, there are written contracts of servitude, and because of that, they still have legal standing that they can go into court and complain about the abuses of their master. There are various limits that those contracts put on the ways that they can be treated. The individual person is not defined as property at law in a servitude contract. They owe their labor to someone, but they are not owned in the same way. And so they're not trafficked in the same way, and bought and sold in the same way as enslaved people are. It's quite a distinction. Enslaved people, they were defined at law as property and could be subjected to anything their owner chose to subject them to. And that's a crucial distinction, and they had no recourse to the courts or other avenues to protest against that treatment. So their resistance had to take other forms that were not sanctioned by law.
Thank you, Greg. I think we can maybe do one more question, and it's on a really important issue, it seems to me, which is the way the information that you have worked with and your interpretations have helped us think not only about the role and effects and legacy of slavery in a US and American context, but more broadly. So there's one question in the chat which asks you about the coincidence between the 1619 date with which you begin and the New York Times Project, which has done so much work to make slavery foundational to our understanding of the making of every institution within the history of the United States. And this question asks whether you happen to know if the founding fathers and colonists were in part revolting against Britain due to concerns that Britain might constrain the slave trade, so that the very act, of course, of independence was one inextricable from an investment in and desire to perpetuate the slave trade. So that's one question that has to do with a uniquely national understanding of the role that this history has played in the US. The other couple questions are asking us to step outside of the US and to think comparatively about how this played out differently. For example, somebody asks why was there so much migration to Brazil? Somebody else asks, I think this is really interesting, there was a surprising amount of slave trade in various Spanish colonies. Why do we not see the same effects of white supremacist and racist pervasive culture that we have seen entrenched early on? That is a huge question, I know, for you, but I think it speaks to what the capacities of generating this information are for changing the ways in which we're asking these questions, for our ability to think them not just individually and nationalistically, but comparatively, differentially, and to continue, I think, to use this information to help us understand the very nature of the category of race and practices of racial formation as ongoing, variegated, historically specific, contextually placed. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how this information relates or might relate to some of those.
Wow, there's so much. There's so much right there.
I just wanted that question out there.
Yeah. So really quickly, the 1619 date that I start with, and it's also, I use it in my book title as well. The enslaved people who arrive in Virginia in 1619 don't come directly from Africa, but they're on a ship that brings them up from the Gulf of Mexico. They're actually stolen off of a Portuguese ship that was delivering people from Africa to Spanish America, and Dutch and English privateers capture that ship, steal people off of it, and reroute some of them to Virginia. And that's the White Lion is the name of the ship. I think it should be as well known as the Mayflower. but they arrive in 1619. I think it's a really interesting, point to bring up, that every school kid knows the name of the Mayflower, and the White Lion that delivered the first enslaved Africans. Most kids don't learn the name of that ship, but also it arrives the year before the Mayflower, which is something I like to point out to people. Mayflower comes in 1620, and the White Lion in 1619. But anyway, so that's why I start there, and I actually spend an early chapter of my book deals with the relationships between privateering and piracy and the slave trade, that because labor was so important to getting colonies off the ground, pirates and privateers often stole enslaved people off of ships and raided other colonies to take them off of land and put them on ships and deliver them to other colonies, right? There's this competition for labor. So a different kind of theft. I mean, the whole slave trade needs to be seen as a theft of people, but anyway, so that's the 1619 tie-in. The American Revolution question, I would actually, as much as I sort of, my politics want me to say yes, I think the short answer is simply no to that question. And the reason why I say that is because the British were the biggest slave traders in the world. On the eve of the American Revolution, there was no organized movement against the slave trade in the British Empire. There's no logic for the North American colonies to throw off British rule to keep the slave trade open. There was no threat to the slave trade in 1775 in the British Empire. And the British anti-slavery or anti-slave trade movement really emerges in the 1780s in the aftermath of the American Revolution, not before it. So I don't really see a connection there to a desire to keep the slave trade open. Probably the easiest thing to do in that case would have been to stay in the British Empire. And in fact, the American colonists, create their non-importation agreements and stuff like that to hurt the British economically, and that actually they cut themselves off from the slave trade temporarily in that. And most of the North American colonies don't reopen the slave trade after the American Revolution. So if the whole war was to keep the slave trade open, it doesn't really make sense that most of the states never actually legalized it, I don't think. So on the global, the comparisons are super fascinating. I mean, the short answers for why so many people to Brazil, sugar was the real engine of the early slave trade and the early slave economy in the Americas, overwhelmingly. So the Caribbean was a hugely important destination. Brazil was a hugely important destination because they grew sugar. It was far and away the largest, most common occupation for enslaved people was working in sugar plantations. And then later there's a gold rush in Brazil, and coffee takes off in Brazil as other staples of the slave economy there.
Greg, can I get you to focus on
Sure.
the
Yeah.
other part of that question? I don't have it in front of me, but what I heard was that the person asking the question didn't seem to be aware of the different but nonetheless racial impacts of enslavement in Latin America, and the new writing. There's been an emergence of all new writing and lots of activism as well by contemporary populations descended from enslaved people. So I just wanted to make sure that people got to hear something about that.
Thank you for calling my attention back to that. That's just such an important, I was losing track of some of the questions, and that's probably the most important one to address. I mean, I would sort of simply argue that discrimination takes different forms in different societies, but there's massive discrimination against formerly enslaved people and the descendants of enslaved people across the Americas in quite profound ways. And that's my short answer to that question. Gina, do you want to chime in with more on that?
I feel
I'm
like we
so
need a
afraid
seminar on
that-
that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm so afraid that this really active conversation, including from all the participants and from this deeply engaged audience, has left us with a little bit over time. But I want to thank you, Greg, and Gina, for all of this. I want to thank you, Greg, for the work you've done, and to thank everybody who attended. And I hope you will come to more of these events to see what we are all doing at UCSC and the kinds of questions we're asking and how we want to keep thinking with those in our community. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you.